Soddy is a small, unremarkable town in the southern United States, but it has a lot of history. Everything from the earliest travelers to the Americas to the first nuclear reactor built after the 3 Mile Island incident. Unfortunately, we don't have time to cover all of that, so let's focus on one of the more interesting and sad pieces of history. One that changed the landscape here forever: the forced removal of the Cherokee Indians.
The Cherokee were known as a civilized tribe. They assimilated very well into the white culture, if you will, or the European culture. They built houses just like everybody else. They owned land. They learned the language. They intermarried with lots of white settlers that came in. And of course, the Cherokee, they had their own language. They had their own written language. We know about Sequoia. We know that our town, one part of our town, is named Soddy. We think it was a Native American word, T-S-A-T-I, to Soddy, meaning land of many springs or sipping place, because of all the springs that are around in this area. So a lot of those Cherokee names still live on today on our maps and place names and things of that nature. So they were very well established.
But they weren't the first, and nor were they alone.
They all had a certain territory. Most of Middle Tennessee was the hunting ground, and they shared it. They didn't really claim it. Indians didn't really believe in claiming land like we do. And, in many ways, they were well ahead of some of the modern day environmentalists, because they realized that if they killed all the game or used up all the fish or whatever they did that would hurt themselves in the long run, then they would actually kind of conserve what they had and what they needed.
This was a fully formed society of people, one that shaped and named this land long before the Europeans ever knew it existed. They were civilized and kind traders, but when pressed, they often felt it was their right to protect this land from being exploited.
And of course, during this time, everything north of the river was open to settlement, and everything south of the river in what is today Chattanooga was still Native American country. There were several instances where settlers would be trying to move into their territory, and they would become hostile toward them. But by and large, they pretty well accepted the fact that they weren't going to be able to stop all the people from coming. They realized they were just going to be overwhelmed, so they tried to get along as best they could.
And the inevitable did come, with the names of Haston Poe and Colonel William Clift, the first Europeans to settle what is now Soddy.
The Clift family was one of the first white settlers that moved here from Knoxville. In fact, when they first moved in, some of this area was still Native American land, and Colonel Clift was forward-thinking enough to buy a lot of that land. I think he once bought 5,000 acres for a penny an acre. And if you want to do the math, it's not much money compared to today. But he became the first millionaire in Hamilton County simply because he was a smart enough businessman to buy land cheap and sell it a lot higher and make a profit.
While Clift made his millions selling land, Haston Poe set out on a much humbler yet quite lucrative business operation. He built a tavern.
The first Poes in this area was Haston and Celia Poe, and they all hailed from Appomattox area in Virginia. They owned several acres, and I'm not sure exactly. My dad would always tell me that basically they owned up above where the tavern is now, probably up above where City Hall is, somewhere in there, all the way down through here, both sides, down below where Walmart is now towards Mimosa Road. So this whole valley area right here, Haston Poe settled with his land grant. So 1818 would have been when the tavern, and they might have started in 1817. Records are vague about that. So we'd say 1817 to 1818, the tavern was built. People think of a tavern, they think of a place where they're selling a lot of beer and just a bar, and that's not what it was. It was really just a boarding home as well as a home for Haston Poe and his family. So that was a big thing they did, was build the road, and would charge a toll to go across it or coming back. And then as people would come back, they would stop and stay at his tavern and spend the night with their, or maybe a couple of nights, and replenish their animals and rest, and then travel on.
The settlers poured in and pushed against the people living here. Eventually, it all came crashing down, and the settlers called for the government to remove the natives.
The main impetus was when they decided that they found gold in Dahlonega, Georgia, and that was the kicker. And they decided, we got to get these people out of the way. Everything was taken away from them, all their land rights, everything was just removed. They finally decided to move them to Oklahoma, and that was what we call the Trail of Tears.
I know that my dad had talked about the time from, I guess, his ancestors telling him that tents were set up all this area from Post Tavern all the way down to where present Walmart is now. I think there were like 1,900 of them, so it was a big encampment. And I'm not sure, they might have been there 2 or 3 days, regaining their strength to make the trek across the mountains over towards Sequatchie Valley and onward west.
So Poe had played his part. Now it was time for Clift to take his turn.
Colonel Clift, and there again his brother-in-law, Robert Clark McCree, were hired by the U.S. government to help remove the Indians from this area because they had a steamboat called the Clift, and so they moved a lot of the Indians from this area to, I think it's Bridgeport, Alabama, is where they moved the Indians from, by a river. So yes, I mean that's pretty much it. I mean, they provided a barge and maybe some escorts for some of the groups of Indians that were moved, but as far as I know, that's about all that they did.
With that, the Indian era came to an end, and the Stone Age was over. The Cherokee were removed so completely that a century later, common folk didn't believe they were ever there.
I grew up on Harmony Lane, about a half mile from what people call the Pocket Wilderness now. When I was a kid, we used to do the same thing that people do now. We used to walk up that dirt road and find us a nice swimming hole to cool off in the summertime. And one day I was with a group of friends and we were walking up that road, and I looked down and I saw a triangular rock. And it had some really funny edges to it. And so I picked it up and I looked at it, and I thought it was an arrowhead, and I showed it to my friends, and they kind of thought I was crazy. And they asked me why I would think that there would be Native Americans in that area. Why would I think that you'd find arrowheads there? And so I threw the rock down and went on my way, and we went swimming that day. Quite a few years later, I started dating a gentleman who collects arrowheads. And every time that I would walk out that road with him, I noticed that he always had his head down and his eyes peeled, and he was looking all around for arrowheads the same way that I had found that one when I was a kid. And so I told him my story, and he told me that that particular area around the creek was actually the perfect place for Native Americans. And so it was actually the perfect place to find an arrowhead. And now I know that I threw my arrowhead down for no reason, and I really wish I had it back.
But there is still some hope for the Cherokee who once lived here. After all, I should know. I'm one of them.
Today, many of them didn't leave. They fled to the mountains, and there's still a large population of Cherokee natives that are still around in Tennessee and mostly in North Carolina.